Hi, this is Starkie Sowers. Welcome again to another Plus Program training series. And this is about cardiovascular health prevention, and it's the second episode. So, as we were talking about in the first episode, we were kind of wrapping it up, so to speak, and talking about cardiovascular disease and some of the situations that come about from that, such as like stroke and heart attack and high blood pressure, as well as poor circulation. And one of the things that we were talking about was atherosclerotic plaque development, or the hardening of the arteries. And we talked about a couple factors that kind of accentuated that. Number one is the imbalance, or the bad ratio, so to speak, of the cholesterol, is the HDL being the good cholesterol, the LDL being the bad cholesterol, especially when they're either elevated in total cholesterol. Usually the typical total they're looking for is about 180 to 200. So if you're like at 250 or something like that, that's obviously elevated. And the other thing they do is they look at the ratios of those HDLs to LDLs. And so if you were to take a person that had like maybe a 180, if they had like about a 50 on the HDL, the remaining 130 would be on the money, so to speak. And so when you pick up those ratios, it's typically going to be about what they call about a 3-to-1 to about a 4-to-1. And anytime those HDLs go up and those LDLs go down, it definitely reduces the risk factor. So another one of the things that we talked about too was homocysteine, which is an out of control free radical that the body can produce when there's inadequate amounts of vitamin B6, folic acid, and B12. So that's kind of an interesting factor, very, very vogue in the late 80s, early 90s. A lot of people talking about homocysteine. And remember, we talked about also the integrity, so to speak, of the artery system. You remember those arteries expand, like almost double their size. And so when we look at the big aortic branch that comes out of the heart, about the size of a garden hose, it's going to double its size almost with every heartbeat, so to speak, and expand and contract. And keeping those things healthy is real critical. So vitamin C is a major factor because that's a collagen tissue. And if there's rips or tears, then the body uses the LDL bad cholesterol and kind of band-aids up those tears or those bleeding sites. And continuous tearing and ripping, as well as out of control free radical damage, causes what we call large amounts of atherosclerotic plaque development. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a nutshell. And then we also talked about some lifestyle and hereditary factors, such as obesity being one of the number one things. And I thought we'd go a little bit more in depth about the obesity on this particular segment. But before we do that, I don't also want to forget that sodium intake, salt, becomes a critical factor. Some people are super salt sensitive. Probably about 15 to 20% of people that have high blood pressure are sodium sensitive. Remember, sodium has a tendency to pull water into the vascular system. So that kind of increases the blood pressure as well too. So there's a balance in the body between sodium and potassium. Typically the RDA, believe it or not, for sodium is about 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams a day. Potassium ends up being about 3,000 to 5,000 milligrams a day. So it's almost double the sodium. And of course, you can expect that most American diets are just the opposite. It's loaded with sodium, like 3,000 plus, and minimal on the potassium, which really creates a water imbalance. So it's almost like trying to stuff more water into a garden hose when you can't do it. Same thing happens when we eat too much sodium. The other thing is it kind of causes some trigger systems in the body with the kidneys and the heart to actually increase blood pressure. So watch the sodium. If you've got high blood pressure, definitely an item that would be of good balance. So getting back to the obesity situation, a couple things. Number one, when there is obesity, it increases the risk of heart disease. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, especially in diabetics. And we'll get to that at the end. So being one that exercises on a regular basis is a great component to help to reduce this risk. And one of the good measures on obesity is waist-hip ratio. So that waist-hip ratio should be about 0.9 for men. So that means you're going to take a tape measure around your butt and a tape measure around your waist and tighten your waist really tight, thinking that you got some abs. It's the best way to actually do it, ironically speaking. So then you divide the two, you take the waist and divide it by the hips, and you should come out with a ratio. And you definitely want to be on that lower spectrum of 0.9 and below for men and 0.8 and below for women. And that'll give you a good guideline to tell you whether or not your diet and your exercise plan are doing well for you. All right, and then we also talked about smoking. We also talked about alcohol consumption. Smoking is definitely the number one causative factor for when it comes to heart disease of all different types, as well as also for other different complications of the vascular system, including the lungs. So, and then when we look at that component of alcohol and smoking together, it literally like doubles that factor. So if you're doing smoking and drinking alcohol, definitely be attentive to how much alcohol you're doing. We talked last time for women, it's one serving of alcohol a day. And so that's usually like 4 to 6 ounces of wine, one beer, and like 1 ounce of hard liquor or something like that. And then for men, it's 1 or 2 a day, and that would be the maximum amount. Okay. kind of keep those things in check. If you can quit smoking, it'd be great. Ran into a buddy of mine the other day. He's a neurosurgeon, and he actually had been smoking all his life and ended up with heart disease, and he quit smoking. So I asked him, I said, "Hey doc, how'd you quit smoking?" He says, "Well, the first thing I did is I started hanging around people that weren't smoking." So maybe that's a tip. Maybe you can take that and use it. Probably has some good advice. Maybe go a mile or two with that. All right. So finally, what I want to do is I want to talk about diabetes. Diabetes 2 is like an alarming disease. They're actually classifying it as a disease, and they're saying it's the #1 contributor to heart disease. When you get diabetes 2, it actually increases your risk of heart disease by about 2 to 4 times the average person. So it's almost just as bad, if not worse, than smoking. So add the 3 of those in combination: alcohol, diabetes, and smoking. You got some really serious issues when it comes to heart complications. So the thing about diabetes is we have a tendency to relate to that diabetes 2, that is, as hoof and mouth disease. So too much mouth, and then lack of hoof, so to speak, or lack of exercise. So maybe reversing that would make a big difference, and getting that waist-hip ratio back in check would be an ultimate thing, or an ultimate goal, in my opinion, to shoot for. All right, so finally, let's talk about foods. There's all sorts of different types of foods that are out there that are beneficial and helpful. You hear about it all the time. Some of the foods we've listed here. When it comes to fatty acids, I think it's critical to remember that omega-3 fatty acids have kind of daunted the whole spectrum of cardiovascular protection larger than anything else. And you think of omega-3 fatty acids, you look at them, the American diet is really lacking in omega-3 fatty acids. What's nice about them, they have an anti-inflammatory effect on that cardiovascular system, not only on the heart, but as well as the artery system. So using omega-3s and having adequate amounts of omega-3s in the diet becomes critical. So where are you going to get omega-3s? Very difficult to get a hold of. So it's going to be fish, it's going to be flax, it's going to be hemp seeds. The other thing, when you look at omega-3s, it's going to be pumpkins, it's going to be cranberries. Those are going to be your food sources, chia. Those are going to be the areas that you're going to be able to get it. So definitely include that on a regular basis in your diet. The other thing is fiber. Fiber actually reduces the absorption of bile. So what's cool about bile is the body takes cholesterol, makes bile, and then bile goes down every time we eat a meal, and the body reabsorbs about 90% of it. So when you have adequate amounts of fiber from nuts and seeds and fruits and vegetables and whole grains, what it does is actually traps that bile, carries it out, and then the body has to make more good cholesterol, HDL, and make more bile. So there's a great component on balancing that HDL and that LDL component. And so then the other thing that I look at, you obviously you want to reduce the sodium intake. Another critical factor here when it comes to different types of diets is eating and staying away from red meat. We know that that's a huge factor. So eat the more lean meats, such as chicken and fish. All right, so finally, supplements. A lot of you guys might be thinking, well, what about supplements? I definitely think supplements are a huge attribute. One thing that happens the older we get, the less coenzyme Q10 we have in our system. And coenzyme Q10 is the #1 antioxidant, especially in the heart and a large organ tissue. And it seems like when the coenzyme Q levels go down, then there's an increased incidence of heart disease. So I definitely recommend supplementing with coenzyme Q10, increasing those mitochondria outputs. The other thing is vitamin C and vitamin E. Make sure that you're getting a multivitamin that has plenty of B6, B12, folic acid as well. And then finally, the minerals selenium and magnesium. Magnesium helps to relax the vascular system, helps with blood pressure control, and selenium is excellent with the production of glutathione, which is one of the great antioxidants in helping with detoxifying and kind of bringing everything back into balance. So that kind of wraps up this session on cardiovascular health. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you looking at the Plus program training videos, and we'll be back with you next month with another training series.